Good evening. Assalamu alaikum, Honorable Prime Minister, ladies and gentlemen. So I'm going to tell you my story in three separate strands which I believe are interlinked based on the work that I do and have been doing for many years now. So I work as a researcher, I'm a scientist. I work on the impacts of climate change in the most vulnerable countries and communities and how those countries and communities can be enabled to adapt to the impacts of climate change. And in particular, we do a lot of work with the most vulnerable countries in the most vulnerable communities in the most vulnerable countries, including particularly the least developed countries. The second strand of my work is as an advisor to the least developed countries caucus group in the negotiations, currently chaired by Ethiopia, where I advise them on the issue of adaptation, and I'll be leaving day after tomorrow to go to Katowice to COP24, which will be my 24th COP. I'm not sure how many more people have been to all the COPs. And my third strand will be about my country, Bangladesh, which, as you all are much aware, is one of the most vulnerable countries to the climate change problem. But I'm going to argue and try and convince you that it's actually at the forefront of solutions to climate change. So let me start with the first one on the impacts of climate change on most vulnerable communities. I've been working on this for at least a decade and a half, and one of the things that we've been doing is every year we bring together communities of practice, and this is now a growing community of practice, on what we call community-based adaptation and sharing that knowledge amongst the communities. We had our 13th conference of parties, not our conference of parties, but the community-based adaptation conference in Malawi a few months ago. And we had a Talanoa dialogue there run by Mary Robinson, the former president of Ireland, who is now a climate envoy of the UN Secretary General. And that was an excellent exercise working on getting all the people who were there. There are several hundred people from all over the world talking about what they wanted to see in the Talanoa, through the Talanoa dialogue, focusing on gender and climate change in particular. And since then, I've also been involved in quite a few other Talanoa dialogues, most recently, just a few days ago, in Bangladesh, where we held a big conference on urban resilience and had a Talanoa dialogue on how urban resilience can be a part of the solution. And I really am very, very convinced and impressed by the use of the Talanoa dialogue in this process, because previously the experience has been people may follow the COP for a few days, see in the newspapers or television what's happening, and then go to sleep for 12 months until the next one. But with the Talanoa dialogues, everyone I've been part of, it's enabled them to have a say in this, to be engaged with it in a way that I don't think I've ever seen before. The general public or people themselves getting involved in deciding or wanting to decide or wanting their voices to go into this. So I very much support the Prime Minister's view that we shouldn't stop at COP24. I think this is something that we should continue and make better as we go along. The second strand that I want to talk about is the work that I've been doing for many, many years now, advising the least developed countries group in the negotiations, currently chaired by Ethiopia, particularly on the issue of adaptation, but now more recently on, unfortunately, the emerging issue of loss and damage, because as many of you will know, we are seeing the impacts of attributable climate change because of human-induced climate change, and it's beyond adaptation. You can't adapt to it once it's happened already. And so in the negotiations, we have this very politically sensitive issue called loss and damage, where we are now, I think, at a level where we need to convey the feeling that these need to be resourced. There is no fund for loss and damage. There's no global funding for loss and damage, as there is for adaptation. And I feel that we need to be doing that, and I will definitely be one of the advocates. I'm not a negotiator myself. As I said, I'm an advisor to negotiators, so I can speak my mind. I don't have to speak on behalf of my country or any other country. And then the third and final element or string to my intertwined stories is my country, Bangladesh, which, as I said earlier, is very well known, is very often cited as the most vulnerable, or at least one of the most vulnerable countries to the impacts of climate change. That is true, but it's really yesterday's truth. Today's truth is very different. Today's truth is a country that is taking the problem more seriously than I would argue any other country. 160 million people are taking climate change extremely seriously, from our Prime Minister to our Finance Minister, who's been putting $100 million a year into a climate change trust fund, to actors within government and civil society. And in particular, since I'm an academic, a professor in a university, the work I do is with young people. And as several speakers before me have said, the young people are the future for us, for the world. And the young people in my university, my students in Bangladesh, they are as bright and as able as any students anywhere. And they are now connected, and the connectivity with the rest of the world is an extremely important feature for them. And to me, the divide, if you like, on the issue of climate change as a global problem is less left-right, Democrat, Republican, as you see in the US, even less poor and rich countries or people. It's much more young generation versus old generation. It's about the young people. If you saw the school boycott the kids are doing around the country, around the different countries, I think that the future lies with them, and enabling them and allowing them to develop their capacities and their abilities to influence decisions is better for us. And we, the old people, are usually reluctant to change, but the kids will make us change, and I really believe that. So basically what I'm going to argue is that in Bangladesh, we have now been taking the issue of climate change very, very seriously. We've been going up a learning curve in terms of building our own adaptive capacity, in building our resilience. And I would argue to a very large extent that Bangladesh is probably one of the most, or on the path to becoming one of the most resilient and adaptive countries to the impacts of climate change. And I would like to invite all of you to come and see what we're doing. And I have quite a few of my students in the audience here who've come and spent time in Bangladesh and seen what's happening there and learned from it. And I think that that's something that we need to be sharing knowledge in real time, effectively across the world, particularly for those who are the victims of the impacts of climate change, not the causes of the problem, and enabling them, supporting them is a global responsibility for everybody. While I absolutely support the need to reduce emissions and to go on to renewable energy by 2050, and Bangladesh is also one of the countries committed to doing that, reducing our, going 100% renewable by 2050. At the same time, I think that, as the Prime Minister also pointed out, the impacts of climate change here and now are real, they're happening, and the poorest communities in the poorest countries need a lot more attention than they've received so far. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.